All right, great. Well, welcome back everyone, and to the fourth and final session in our boot camp short course webinar series. Again, it's not the full week-long in-person course, but it still is quite a commitment, and we've spent quite a few hours together at this point. So I do want to thank everyone who's been able to stick with us throughout the entire series, or folks who've just joined for one or two sessions. We're so excited by the questions and discussions that you've brought so far, and we're very excited to bring you one last great session. So again, for folks who might not know me yet, my name is Allegra Wrocklage, and I'm with the Conservation Finance Network. And I'll be moderating this session, which is called Conservation Finance Opportunities with Private Capital. This session is going to explore a range of case studies and how private capital is being brought to bear for land and resource conservation. So like the session that we had earlier today, we're going to have 5 excellent panelists who will each provide us short presentations that give us a broad overview of their work. So our goal for this session, again, as the one earlier today, is to introduce you all to how some of the conservation finance tools and strategies that we introduced you to on Tuesday and just started to discuss are being used by practitioners. Each of the panelists is going to speak to projects and work in their specific geographies. However, we're hopeful that they'll be able to share lessons learned with each of you that you can extrapolate into your own regions and to your own work. And again, we really hope that these short presentations are going to spark ideas and questions and hopefully maybe inspire future collaborations. Each of the panelists is going to share their emails with you, and they'll be open to follow up questions and connections. So hopefully this session is, again, just the start of further discussions and ideas. So I'm going to briefly introduce our 5 panelists. We're so excited to have them with us today. First off, we'll have Katherine Birnie with Ecosystem Investment Partners, and she'll be discussing opportunities in wetland mitigation. We'll have Mark Lambert with Quantified Ventures, and he's going to share Quantified Ventures' pioneering work on pay-for-performance deals. Jacob Israelow with Dirt Capital Partners will be discussing private equity in agriculture. Keith Bisson with CEI is going to introduce what community development financial institutions, CDFIs, what they are, what they do, and also discuss their connection to conservation financing work. And then finally, Dylan Jenkins with Finite Carbon is going to discuss trends in the forest carbon market. So a couple of logistics items before we dive in. As you all hopefully know by now, these webinars are being recorded. We will have them up on CFN's website later on. So we won't be sharing the slides from these presentations, since you will eventually have access to the recorded presentations themselves. But they're just being offered live right now to applicants of the 2020 boot camp, as well as select CFN partners. So we have muted all of our attendees. So if you do have questions.
I think that was because I had to.
Oh, Dylan, you made it on. So we're having some technical difficulties. So very, very happy to see your face and hear your interruption. So like I was saying, all our attendees will be on mute during the session. So if you do have questions, please just put them in the Q&A box. Like we're doing rapid fire presentations. So we're going to hold all questions to the end for the presenters to answer, but they might have a chance to answer them by typing in the Q&A box while other folks are presenting. So you might get your answers before the end of the session as well. And for my presenters, I just want to remind you all, these are going to be pretty short presentations, about 10 minutes each. So at about the 8-minute mark, I'm just going to turn on my screen and wave hello and let you know that you have 2 minutes left. And if you go over 10 minutes, I'm probably going to turn on my screen again and hang out and be a little bit more forceful, but I trust you all to be on time. So hopefully we won't have to do that. And one more thing before we dive into the presentations. So I just wanted to highlight CFN's report, Private Capital for Working Lands Conservation, which we just published a few years ago. Normally we have this report as required reading for the in-person boot camps. So I just wanted to suggest this as a companion reading for this session if you find it interesting. This report presents a series of case studies on conservation finance projects that use private capital that are in various stages of development. Some of the case studies are soil carbon markets or sage grouse habitat credits or investment funds for working lands, just a couple of the case studies that are in here. And through analyzing these case studies in conservation markets, CFN was able to create a market development framework that describes how these projects move through the different stages of market development. So how a project might start out in the early market phase, grow into a pilot, eventually develop into an early market phase, and then finally enter the mature market where it's able to attract more traditional investment. And our goal with this framework was to help project developers understand what steps they might need to go through and what sources of capital they should look for or expect to receive when they are in different stages of market development. So for example, if your project is an early market phase or pilot, you might be looking for more grant capital versus later mature phase, you might be lucky enough to be getting some private investors and institutional investors and things like that. So anyways, that's a really quick look into what this resource offers. And again, if you find this session compelling, we do recommend that you read through this report, which you can find on CFN's website. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Katherine, who will take it away with the presentations.
Thanks, Allegra. It's so nice to see all of you virtually. I was a participant in the first Conservation Finance Bootcamp in 2007. And I am so glad that Lee, Allegra, Brad, Amy, and others have kept it alive and well as a tremendous resource. I'm going to cover two things today. First, what are wetland and stream mitigation markets? And then second, how do private capital and land trusts enter into them? If you could please advance the next slide, Allegra. Thanks. So fundamentally, wetland and stream mitigation markets, both the demand for the credits that my firm produces, as well as our supply of those credits, are both driven by regulation. Principally the Federal Clean Water Act, Section 404, which specifies that any developer, whether that developer is public or private, if their development project has unavoidable impacts to federally jurisdictional wetlands or streams, those impacts to those resources must be mitigated or offset. And there are fundamentally two ways that a developer can procure that offset. They can turn to a third party and for an outsourced solution and buy a so-called mitigation bank credit or a so-called in lieu fee credit on the shelf and in inventory. Those credits are a result of private firms like mine, which is called Ecosystem Investment Partners, or in some cases, nonprofits or state agencies, doing restoration projects, certifying that ecological uplift that's achieved on site through the regulatory agencies. Those regulatory agencies certify credits that reside in a, quote, virtual bank that the entity that developed that bank or in lieu fee program can then sell to permittees. So that's the third party compliance mechanism. Or a developer, permittee, can accomplish the mitigation themselves by doing their own restoration project. Restoration or mitigation that's to compensate for an impact under the Clean Water Act must be within the same watershed in which the impact occurred. And these watersheds are typically regulated at the 8-digit USGS hydrologic code unit. Another thing that's important to note is that the agencies require that our restoration projects of wetlands or streams be permanently protected either with a conservation easement or a deed restriction. So of course, bear that in mind as we go on and talk about the interface with land trusts. Next slide, please, Allegra. So demand for the mitigation product, whether it's a wetland credit or a stream credit, is fundamentally driven by the transportation sector on both sides. So the biggest customer nationally for these products is transportation sector, followed by, for wetlands, mining and oil and gas activities, and for streams, commercial, residential, and industrial building. So you can imagine these are the kinds of activities that have a large footprint. In the case of roads, they typically cannot avoid water resources. And so this is where demand for these products comes from in the marketplace. Next slide, please. Our market is roughly a $4 billion market annually. Again, it's entirely driven by by regulation. Our demand comes entirely from regulation, the Federal Clean Water Act. About the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers issue about 4,000 permits every year across the country that require wetland and stream mitigation. You can see on the bottom graphs, year over year, roughly about 10,000 acres of permitted wetland impacts require mitigation, and about 350 miles of stream impacts require mitigation every year. So this is just to give you, kind of put your arms around what is the size of the mitigation markets. Next slide, please, Allegra. And then this slide gives you a breakdown of the market share among the methods. As I mentioned, there's the outsourced methods are buying a mitigation bank credit from an entity that's already put restoration in the ground and certified that restoration, or by buying a credit from an in lieu fee program that takes in fees from developers with a promise to later put restoration in the ground in that same watershed where the impact occurred. And then finally, the do-it-yourself method, the permittee responsible method. So the point of this slide is to show you that over time, the marketplace has shifted to outsourcing mitigation to specialized firms like ours and many others, as well as nonprofits who specialize in mitigation or who partner with specialized firms. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So the way we at Ecosystem Investment Partners, we are a handful. We're just one of a handful of firms that do this work nationally. We have projects from the tip of Alaska to the tip of Florida and everywhere in between. We have 43 active projects and 17 more in the permitting process. We've restored 175 miles of stream and 44,000 acres of wetland. And again, all of that is permanently protected either with a conservation easement or a deed restriction. In sum total, mitigation banks across the country have not only restored, but also permanently protected over 1 million acres of land across the country. So that's where the conservation piece comes in. I personally came out of the land conservation world. I've been at EIP for 11 years. Prior to EIP, I was at the Peninsula Open Space Trust in California and the Maine Coast Heritage Trust in Maine. Our co-founder and a number of my colleagues at EIP also came out of the conservation world, and we share the collective vision that in doing this work, this mitigation work, we're bringing an additional piece of capital to bear on the vitally important philanthropic and government sources of capital already available in the conservation space. I want to just share a couple of examples of how land trusts and other conservation nonprofits and agencies engage in the mitigation markets. So there are 3 fundamental ways. The first such way is to partner with a mitigation specialist, like, for example, to partner with Ecosystem Investment Partners or one of the other numerous firms across the country that do this work. So we have partnered with land trusts on land search and assemblage. So the Conservation Fund helped us orchestrate a very innovative land exchange in Minnesota, whereby we were able to assemble 24,000 acres and do a land exchange between a private timber company, county tax forfeit lands, and state trust lands. That entire land assemblage was done for us by the Conservation Fund. We also worked with land trusts as conservation easement holders. The Nature Conservancy and the Land Conservancy of Texas both hold a number of conservation easements for us. A third way that land trusts can partner with specialized mitigation firms is by being the long-term steward of the project. The Army Corps of Engineers that permits our projects requires that there's a designated long-term steward that, among other things, is the recipient of an endowed pot of money that can help with the maintenance and monitoring of the restoration in perpetuity.
2 minutes, Katherine.
Thanks so much. Finally, we have partnered with the Nature Conservancy in particular on their ecological design and restoration expertise. So we have several projects in southern Louisiana and Texas that are in the longleaf pine wetland ecosystem, in which the Nature Conservancy has renowned expertise. So the Nature Conservancy designed our restoration plan. Two other ways that land trusts can partner two other ways that land trusts can be involved in the restoration space. First of all, by directly engaging in the space, the Great Land Trust, Ducks Unlimited, Conservation Fund, Nature Conservancy, among many others, own and operate and sell their own mitigation, whether through an in lieu fee program or a series of mitigation banks. And then finally, land trusts can be the recipients of in lieu fee mitigation funds for which they can apply and then go out and do conservation and restoration projects. So for example, in Maine, the Nature Conservancy operates an in lieu fee program. They collect funds in watersheds across the state, and then they issue requests for proposals for land trusts to essentially apply for those funds in order to do projects. Looking forward to taking all of your questions later in the Q&A, and I'll turn it back over to Allegra and Mark.
Great. And actually, I think, Dylan, if you're ready to go, we can just go to you and stay in order. Does that sound good? Oh, Dylan, I think we're missing your volume.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks for working with me to get on. We had a couple of hiccups there, but here we are. And I am about to get slammed with a storm coming in, so hopefully the connection will stay good. But good to be with you all today. So, what to say about forest carbon offset markets in 10 minutes. If you've been on any of our previous webinars that I've presented before, we usually go through kind of the 101, the project development process, weave in the different actors and players and the transactions. I'm going to focus primarily on transactions today. Offsets are a very powerful land protection and conservation tool for landowners of all types. About a quarter of our clients are land trusts. We have about 50 projects under development. And we've generated about $800 million for our clients over the past 7 years, primarily in the compliance market, and about 3 million acres. And there's about that much again through other landowners, including many land trusts like the Conservation Fund and the Nature Conservancy that sometimes develop their own projects. So, this isn't a niche-y kind of, opportunity that's generated significant conservation finance. But again, what's driving this, and as it was just said earlier, it's really the buyers. It's not because the the landowners are developing projects and that's driving the market. It's because there's a demand side, and these are large companies. And I don't know, are you advancing the slides? There you go. Thank you, Allegra. So pre-pandemic, it seemed like every day there was a new announcement that was being made by Fortune 500 company like BP or Delta or BlackRock. And it was, I mean, just about every week there was a new, very aspirational, greenhouse gas reduction goal that was being announced. These are the drivers of the market. These companies have many ways that they're looking to ultimately reduce their greenhouse gas emissions footprint, ultimately by emitting less to begin with. But it's going to take 10, 15, 20 years to bend that emissions curve down. And offsets serve a very important function in that overall strategy, or basically the decarbonization of our global economy. That as we're putting a price on carbon and spurring the innovation of new carbon reduction technologies, we're going to need to use offsets for some portion of reducing, or at least accounting for, greenhouse gas emissions. The thing about it is that as all of these companies are out there searching for offsets, they want different things, and their desire for offsets or for commodities that are like them translate into very different types of propositions for landowners. And for landowners and their service providers, be that a land trust or a consulting forester, it's kind of comparing apples to dragon fruit sometimes. Just trying to understand and harmonize the different deal structures. But suffice it to say that there is demand, and as you'll see this in a bit, for tens of millions of offsets per year, with forest offsets being really kind of the charismatic offsets that folks are looking for. You go to the next slide, please. So what kind of one of the punchlines here is really to be an informed consumer, regardless of where you are or what your role is in an offset transaction. Again, knowing that all these companies are making major greenhouse gas reduction commitments, and acknowledging that the global marketplace is in a significant period of decarbonization and transition, and it's happening very quickly. In some ways, the pandemic has slowed it down. In some ways, it's sped it up, because we've seen at least the European oil majors double and triple down on their greenhouse gas reduction commitments. Very different on this side of the Atlantic, though. There was actually an article that came out today in Financial Times, and it compared 9 of the oil majors and showing how folks like BP and Shell and Repsol are really committing to transforming their companies during even before the pandemic and now, whereas some of the oil majors here in the United States not so much. So there's a lot of variation amongst buyers, but again, all of these different buyers, their propositions can create a lot of noise. So the questions that we strongly encourage any landowner or their service providers to ask in evaluating a transaction goes beyond price. Price is very sexy. It's very charismatic. We're all familiar with price when we go to buy a good or a service. But there's a lot more to a carbon offset transaction than simply price, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the questions that we strongly encourage landowners to ask, and their service providers, exactly what product or commodity is being generated. In other words, is it an offset? Is it some sort of cost share payment for carbon practices? Is it an annual carbon lease for deferred harvest? And then what are the landowner commitments, and for how long? There's a lot of variation, not just because of who the buyers are, but because of the different various standards and protocols that are out there, knowing exactly what you're signing up for. And I guess this is one of the punchlines at the end, and I'll say it now. Price is important, but overall, any kind of carbon transaction, our view and our encouragement is to look at it in terms of an overall kind of cost benefit framework. In other words, do you have enough information about who's going to buy, what kind of pricing they're going to pay, what kind of volume they're committing to, the buyer is committing to in a contract, that you can look at, 5, 8 years down the road and see how, it's going to net out for you. Is that transparent? Or are there more questions that you need to ask about the deal structure to make sure that you understand exactly what you're getting into? And which leads me to the deal structure is, are you looking at, guaranteed payments, guaranteed volume? Is some of that the purchase on an option? Or are you kind of, taking the ride for potential, upside that, in the hopes that you're going to see pricing go up and that you want to take that ride. Meanwhile, the markets may go down as well. And then finally, and this isn't an indictment on anybody who's being innovative, but, is the program offering fully baked? Or is the landowner asking to commit to something that's still in development? And there is a lot of innovation going on in this space, and it's a good thing because there needs to be innovation. There's a lot of barriers to entry for landowners, especially with regard to the cost of and methods for inventory and verification. So, good on the folks that are trying to, reduce or eliminate those barriers of entry to landowners, but just be very aware of what you're getting into and knowing if you're, how much of the proposition that's coming at you is guaranteed versus, kind of option and hopeful thinking. Next slide, please. So, just quickly, how do voluntary offset markets work? Well, there's you and me and millions of potential consumers out there that are buying offsets on what we would call a micro transaction, and you can see go to places like Cool Effect and TerraPass, and you can offset, you can purchase offsets for a wedding, one offset or 10 offsets here or there.
I just want to give you your 2-minute warning, Dylan.
Thank you. Yeah, but most of the market is being driven by the large buyers. Next slide. So in the compliance market, the punchline here is that it's driven by California. We've had a great 7-year run. The prices are fairly high, but it's a very niche opportunity, and it's no longer an opportunity for most landowners that are outside of California. Next slide. So voluntary, here there are lower barriers to entry, and that's mainly in the project life. There are lower costs for development in terms of inventory and verification. These are all being driven by corporate social responsibility buyers, and their transactions tend to be fairly small compared to compliance, in the thousands to tens of thousands of offsets per transaction. There's a mismatch there between their ability to absorb a number of offsets and the number of offsets that are needed in a forest offset project to be feasible, which are in the hundreds of thousands of tons. There's also lower pricing, but again, you have to evaluate these opportunities in a cost-benefit framework. Next slide, please. So, again, just to show pricing in California, it started out about $9 back in June 2013, has gone up, and then pandemic hit. We've seen a bifurcation in the compliance market where there are projects, if you're lucky enough to have land in the state of California or adjacent geographies, you're in a good place because there's demand for those offsets, and that market's probably going to be short. If you're outside of California, you're probably not going to be playing in the compliance market. Next slide. So in voluntary offset pricing, so there again, this is all pre-pandemic, but there were huge, big ramp up, 2-3-fold increase in the number of offsets that were demanded 2017 to 2018, but the pricing stayed flat. And I won't get into the market dynamics there, but you can see for forestry and land use, this is gross pricing around a little over $3 per ton. Now in the U.S., we've seen better pricing between $5 and $10 per ton gross pricing, but that's what we're looking at global average. And then last slide, please. So I know that there's a lot going on here, but this is sort of to bring it all home that on the retail side, microtransactions, you'll see higher pricing, but that's not what the landowner actually gets. If you as a consumer are paying $10, $12, $14 per ton, maybe half of that is going to go to the landowner, which is still not bad. But landowners, when they're developing a project, are developing hundreds of thousands of offsets, and that's a very illiquid market. There are very few buyers on the planet that can absorb hundreds of thousands of forest offsets. So I guess the punchline here is that transactions will erode your margin. It's important to understand again exactly what you're getting into in an offset transaction. Who's the buyer? What kind of guarantees are they providing you in terms of pricing and volume in a contract? Know who you're doing business with, and seller. So beware. That's it. Thanks,
Great.
Allegra.
Thank you so much, Dylan. As always, you give a really great overview of the market and trends to look out for a pretty large and complicated subject. So thank you so much for that. Next, we will have Mark Lambert with Quantified Ventures. I think, Mark, I just requested your video to start, so you should be up in a second.
Yeah, and I see the title slide there, Allegra.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take it away.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. This is Mark Lambert. I am director at Quantified Ventures. We're an outcomes-based impact investing advisory firm. And I'm going to talk today about 3 specific transactions that we have either closed or are in process of working on or closing, each of which are based on pay for performance, or what we call outcomes-based financing principles. So Allegra, if you go to the next slide, please. So this first project is an urban project. I'm going to talk about an urban, a rural, and a landscape scale project in my presentation here. This is an urban project. It was the first project that Quantified Ventures did. It was the very first, what we call environmental impact bond. This was structured and launched in 2016 in partnership with the DC Water and Sewer Authority. And this project was aimed at financing green stormwater infrastructure for the city of Washington, D.C. As an alternative to traditional gray infrastructure for what are called combined sewer overflows, which is where you have stormwater and wastewater in the same combined sewer system. And when it rains, as it tends to do very heavily in Washington, D.C., you have sewer overflowing into the Potomac and into other sources of fresh water. And Washington, D.C. wanted to try out green infrastructure, things like permeable pavement, rain gardens, green roofs, et cetera, as an alternative to a $2 billion tunnel system, $2.5 billion tunnel system. And so we worked with them to design a municipal bond that we called an environmental impact bond. And the innovation here was that because the green infrastructure was new, unproven, and untested for DC Water and Sewer Authority, the transaction structure was intended to shift the risk from DC Water, a not very risk or a risk-averse entity, to an entity that is more suited to take that risk, which is the investor. And that's the essence of the outcomes-based principle here. So the point is, we structured this bond with them, $26 million to develop green urban stormwater infrastructure. And Allegra, if you'll go to the next slide, which is a little bit overwhelming, but I want to point out what I think is the key innovation or aspect of this project. That bell curve on the left is the representation visually of how we shifted risk. And don't need to kind of understand the fancy terms or numbers here, but the idea is that to incentivize DC Water to implement a project that they had no familiarity with, green infrastructure, we structured the rate of return on the bond they issued. So they issued a bond, it was sold to 2 private investors. So we have private investors paying for the green infrastructure. And if that green infrastructure underperformed, meaning it didn't capture as much stormwater as DC Water expected it to, DC Water actually got a payment back from the investor, in this case in the amount of $3.3 million on a $26 million bond, to account for that underperformance, meaning the performance risk of a new and innovative project type was shifted onto the investor. And this is a key aspect of outcomes-based financing. And what the point I want to illustrate with this particular project and slide is risk transfer is something that we view as really important and relevant for private capital shifting risk from entities that aren't suitable to take it or suited to take it onto an investor who are getting a return but therefore willing to take risk is an important aspect of what we do, and I think an important benefit of where private capital can push forward conservation finance. So that's the first project I wanted to go through. Allegra, if you'll go to the second slide. This next project uses a similar structure, the environmental impact bond model, which I just described, only it's for the creation of regional recreation infrastructure in the form of an 88-mile mountain biking trail that's being constructed currently just outside of Athens, Ohio, in the Wayne National Forest. And in this case, the bond structure, where we are shifting risk onto investors, et cetera, is still used. The bond is being issued by the city of Athens, Ohio, who are really at the gateway to the Bailey's, what's going to be called the Bailey's mountain biking trail system, and therefore will be the beneficiary of that mountain biking trail. And the benefits that the city of Athens will be receiving are primarily from economic development. So job opportunities, tax revenue from tourism, bed tax and sales tax and parking meters, which are tangible, quantifiable impacts and benefits to the city's tax rolls that come to the city as a result of being next to what will really be a world-class mountain biking trail and recreational amenity. And so in this particular project, which cost around $11 million to construct this mountain biking trail, we used an example of stacking public and private capital. So around $7.5 million of that $11 million came from grants. Folks like REI, for example, who are interested in promoting outdoor recreation infrastructure, and other grants from foundations. And then a $3.5 million bond issuance, as I mentioned, from the city of Athens, Ohio, that will be repaid from those increased tax from hotels and sales tax sources. So this is an opportunity where public and private capital have been stacked together to achieve some form of outcome, in this case, the development of recreational infrastructure. And so, Allegra, if you go to the next slide, an important point I want to make with this project is coalition building. You'll see our logo, Quantified Ventures logo, is one of more than 20 that needed to come together in order for this project to work effectively, to be financed, to be designed, developed, all the way from the state level government to a county level government, intergovernment coalition that we had to build, down to the City Council of Athens, Ohio, the Park Service, private landowners, public landowners, et cetera. And so that project is a good example of outcomes-based financing, the outcomes being repayment of the bond using enhanced revenue from a recreational asset being developed, but most importantly, the building of a diverse and powerful and passionate coalition of partners, which is typically something we think of as very important, if not essential, to these outcomes-based transactions working, and really more broadly to conservation finance operating effectively at scale generally. So I have one more project to talk to you about. This is a project that's in its first year of operation, currently in the state of Iowa. It's called the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. The intention of this project is to leverage private capital, impact investment capital, in order to provide payments to farmers to implement conservation practices on their farm, things like cover crops, conservation tillage, et cetera. And those practices have specific environmental outcomes that we're searching for, namely carbon sequestration in soils and improvement in water quality impairment through the reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. These practices also tend to have other benefits such as biodiversity and habitat conservation and flood mitigation. But the idea is to use private capital in an arena that heretofore has been dominated by public capital, public funding from state or federal sources to incentivize agricultural conservation. And then,
Mark.
Thanks, Allegra. And then to sell the environmental outcomes I mentioned, the carbon sequestration, or tons of carbon sequestered in the soil, and water quality improvements to beneficiary customers. Specifically, we're working with 2 wastewater treatment utilities who are purchasing the nitrogen and phosphorus credits resulting from these practices. And And on the other side, Cargill, the largest privately held company in the United States, and you saw Dylan's slide about corporates making sustainability commitments. Cargill has done so as well. They're purchasing all the carbon reductions to apply against their internal Scope 3 greenhouse gas mitigation targets. So these aren't fungible credits in a market, they're directly for reducing the carbon footprint of a large corporate entity engaged in agribusiness. So what we're doing here is stacking together different kinds of beneficiaries in the same transaction by monetizing the specific outcome they're looking for, and using the sale of those outcomes or the proceeds from that sale to repay the private investment we raised in order to pay those farmers to implement those practices on the farm. And then just our last slide here is the outcomes fund transaction structure. The takeaway that I want to leave with you here, we talked about shifting risk, we talked about coalition building. We typically also need to see innovative transaction structures that come together with a variety of capital sources, a variety of stakeholders, a variety of outcomes that are being monetized in order to incentivize conservation at scale. And one last note, the monitoring and verification of those discrete outcomes that we're generating and that are being verified and sold to our customers is a critical component here too. That's a third-party verifier, something that's analogous to traditional carbon markets as well, and I think something that both of the previous presenters would agree is very important to these conservation markets being developed further as well. So that's, I think, the end of my slides, Allegra. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. And let me just start Jacob's video quickly. All right, Jacob, do we have you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. All right, take it away, Jacob.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. Hope everyone's having a good afternoon. My name is Jacob Israelow. I'm the founder and managing director of Dirt Capital Partners. We are an impact investment company. We invest in farmland, that is agricultural real estate, in a way that supports land access and business growth for small-scale regenerative farm operations. We seek to invest in farm projects in partnership with specific farm businesses that have strong business models and excellent stewardship practices. So we can go to the next slide, Allegra. This slide summarizes our activity to date. We've done 25 projects since 2014, thus far entirely concentrated in the Northeast United States, except for one. All of those projects are in Central or Eastern New York and New England. Each of these projects is structured to facilitate the transfer of ownership of the farmland that we've invested to the farmer that we're working with within a 10-year period of time. It's a structure which aligns incentives around property investment and upkeep and management. The farmer treats the land like they're going to own it one day, because that's our mutual intention, is that there will be a purchase in 5 to 10 years. Most of our projects are structured as lease purchase arrangements, where from the outset, we work very closely with our farmer partners on business and cash flow projections, underwriting like an agricultural lender would. But then unlike an agricultural lender, we're able to structure a lease arrangement over a 10-year period of time that's really customized to that agricultural operations expected cash flow. And then we pre-agree on what the purchase price is going to be at the end of the lease term, and almost always have an early purchase option after 5 or 6 years. We also work very closely with land trusts to place conservation easements on properties, and also state and federal conservation programs like the NRCS EQIP program and other programs. All right, next slide, please, Allegra. So we kind of generally act to fill gaps where conventional agricultural loans are not a fit or not available for a particular farm operation or project. The most common are kind of summarized here, include it kind of an early stage farmer in business 3 to 5 or 10 years, who's built up a pretty, solid business on a leased property, and are looking to move to kind of a permanent home farm property. We do a lot of projects like that. We also do a lot of projects with mid-career farmers who, have been operating for, a decade or two, on a home farm, have an excellent business. Neighbor's property or nearby property comes up for sale. Once in a generation, maybe opportunity to expand your business, provide a larger land base, potentially for your children if they want to take over the farm. So we work on a lot of projects like that as well. And then we also work on a lot of priority conservation projects where we cooperatively and creatively work with farmers and land trusts to structure transactions that work for everyone. And then finally, something we're kind of doing more and more of lately is working on transitioning existing farm businesses, where there's an existing successful business where farmers want to retire and not just sell the land, but also transfer that existing operation to a younger farmer to help facilitate those transitions and purchase land and lease it to new farmers and put them in a position to buy that land from us after 5 to 10 years. So I'll go through a couple of case studies that are emblematic of the types of projects and farmers we work with, and then do some kind of zooming back out, bigger picture framing. So thanks, Allegra, you anticipated the change. So this is one of the earlier projects we did. This was in 2014, a diversified fruit and vegetable farmer in a pretty high value location in northern New Jersey, sells all of their product directly into New York City, directly to consumers at farmers markets. Worked pretty closely with this farmer to try to buy the farm that he had been leasing. Weren't able to come to terms with the seller, who thought that his farm was worth a lot more than it was. Working with a local land trust, we're able to identify another farm that wasn't yet listed on the market that was a great alternative for him. Negotiated a transaction, worked very closely with the local land trust and the state of New Jersey Agricultural Development Committee, the SADC's conservation easement program, to sell an easement to them about 3 years after closing. Also worked, very collaboratively with Grow NYC, which is an organization in New York City that hosts a lot of the farmers markets that you see in New York City, and also provides a lot of technical assistance to farmers, for ongoing support. This project is about 5 or 6 years in, and with some COVID-related exceptions over the last couple months being a pretty big disruptor to his business and his ability to sell into those New York City markets, the project is is very much on track. Okay, we can move to the next slide, Allegra. This is a project that represents kind of another type of the business we work with. It is kind of like a diversified direct market and value add business. This is in Mid-Coast Maine. The farmers have a couple of different enterprises on this property. They make cheese, partly from their own livestock, partly from milk that they buy in. They also raise livestock, both for the milk and to sell meat. And then also operate a custom sawmill operation on the woodlot here. We work pretty closely with these farmers to help them, negotiate a good price and then acquire this property in close collaboration with Maine Farmland Trust, which purchased an easement on the property in a simultaneous closing. So there was no gap required, something that they're able to do in Maine because the funds don't have a kind of a state or federal approval process. They kind of have those funds captive and internally. And we worked with these farmers and a number of other partners on the transaction in addition to Maine Farmland Trust. There were tens of thousands of dollars of very low interest financing by a state finance authority in Maine to build out the creamery for cheese making. And then also worked very closely with CEI of Maine, which Keith will tell you more about, I think next, on technical assistance and business planning. Moving on to kind of third type of project, we've done a lot of work with organic dairy farms in our region. A lot of work, especially with 100% grass-fed organic dairy farms. This is another pretty early project that we did in early 2015. Helped these farmers relocate from a leased farm to their home farm. They're part of the Organic Valley Co-op. This project was in a location that did not require sale of a conservation easement to make the property affordable for the farmers. It's in central New York in an area where ag is the highest and best use. But with the farmers, we did work with NRCS on a pretty large EQIP grant that we helped provide some bridge financing for. We also invested, and this is true on all of these three projects, in some additional infrastructure to support the operation beyond just the purchase of the property. And these farmers actually just exercised their purchase options. So they just bought the property from us in April, I believe, at their 5-year early purchase option mark. And they've basically been using the land for, for pasture for their organic dairy cows, and really improved land that had previously been, just kind of cropped and hayed, and used holistic planned grazing to improve, soil health, and create other ecological outcomes.
2 minutes.
Okay. Let's keep going.
Sorry.
Nope, I think we're right on track. Yeah, like Mark was saying, we really not only like to, but I think kind of require working with a lot of other partners to support projects. A lot goes into making these projects work. And so working with land trusts, other lenders, business advisors, university extension staff, NRCS programs, other service providers is really critical to setting projects up for long-term success. We're a pretty small team. We're just three and a half right now, actually. And so we really do like to develop long-term collaborative working relationships with partners. We've got really strong relationships with several land trusts around our region and other organizations like CEI that we can kind of partner with and collaborate on financing as capital providers. I think when working with land trusts in particular, our experience evaluating and supporting the farm viability piece of the equation in the conservation is something we found is a big value add that we provide to farmland conservation projects. We consider ourselves, and I think most farmers we work with consider us not just a capital partner, but also a technical partner when it comes to both business planning and decision making, and also kind of the upfront work of negotiating and managing transactions on farm properties that can be pretty complicated and drawn out, especially when dealing with land conservation transactions. And last slide. Current project criteria, we're still primarily focused on the Northeast United States, but starting to look in other regions, trying to work with businesses that have at least 100,000 in annual gross revenue, or at least projected to get there pretty soon. Established businesses with a couple of years of sales history, and projects over $500,000, right now up to $3 million, could probably go over, if we needed to, but we haven't had that opportunity yet. And I think I didn't mention at the beginning, but we basically do this by raising funds every couple of years from private investors. Currently about 30. We just closed our third fund with about $15 million. And it's primarily high net worth individuals and family offices, and increasingly charitable foundations where our work aligns with their mission around regenerative agriculture and or supporting local food or or rural economic livelihood. So those are the sorts of investors that we work with. They're very supportive and flexible as well, and these are kind of the main reasons. Sometimes investors care about all four. Sometimes they care primarily about one or two of these. But kind of supporting local food production and regenerative agriculture for its own sake, supporting it for the potential to sequester carbon, other conservation outcomes, and like I said, investing in rural economy. So happy to answer questions. And again, thanks for paying attention.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. Great examples there. Keith, you are up last. Do you?
Thanks, Allegra. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
I'm keeping it simple with just one slide here as the last speaker, and I do encourage you to go to our website at ceimaine.org if you have further questions and stuff. But It's really an honor to be here with all of you. And I've actually never attended the Conservation Finance Boot Camp, but I've always wanted to go. So I'm glad that I can do it at least virtually here. But my name is Keith Bisson, and I'm the president of Coastal Enterprises Incorporated, CEI. We're based in Brunswick, Maine. We are a mission-driven investor and community development financial institution, or CDFI. You may have heard that acronym. There are 1,100 CDFIs across the country. I wouldn't say exactly like CEI. We're quite a diverse industry of organizations. But as a CDFI, we're all certified by the U.S. Treasury Department. And I won't get into the details of that, but it is an important certification for us. As part of our work, we seek to build an economy that works for everyone by growing good jobs, environmentally sustainable enterprises, and more broadly shared prosperity here in Maine, and through several financing subsidiaries in other parts of rural America and small gateway cities across the U.S. As a Mainer, I do love to see all the Maine connections in the previous presenters' presentation. So thank you all for that. Part of the way we do our work is that we provide business advice, which Jacob just alluded to a little bit with one of the farms that they've worked with, as well as capital to help support the launch and growth of small businesses and community facilities that typically aren't served by traditional sources of capital or information. We also work to expand economic inclusion by connecting people with low incomes or others who face systemic barriers, not only to capital, but to skills training, good jobs, and financial counseling. And then we bring lessons from all this work to our advocacy work to help create policy solutions that support underserved populations and rural livelihoods more general. To give you a sense of our scale, last year, CEI made 100 new loans totaling a little over $13.5 million to small businesses across Maine. Our loan portfolio is now roughly 400 loans totaling $50 million, which is our largest to date. Because of time, I won't get into the numbers on our subsidiaries, but we do have multiple for-profit subsidiaries, mission-aligned for-profit subsidiaries focused on venture capital, commercial and industrial solar finance, and something called the New Markets Tax Credit Program. And I am going to highlight a New Markets deal in a minute. But just wanted to note personally and professionally, you know, my passions and interests have centered on this whole intersection that I think we're all talking about of economics and economic justice in many ways with environmental sustainability. And I'm really passionate about that connection of about the natural world, but also how rural and urban communities can develop more integrated, equitable relationships with each other. So just share that, because even though our work is a bit different from what you've just heard, I do have a lot of affinity for all of my friends and colleagues in the conservation finance world, and hope to meet those of you I haven't met in person at some point. So I've long believed, and even before I came to CEI has also believed organizationally and acted on this belief that the sustainable management of our country's working lands is critical to the health of people and communities throughout the country. Over the past 43 years, we were founded in 1977. We've invested in hundreds of agricultural and food businesses, fisheries and aquaculture businesses, and forestry related businesses. I'm just highlighting those as sort of natural resource related stuff, but because we are involved in other sectors of the economy. And I'll share a forestry example in a moment, but I did want to just share some broader context about rural America, because I think it's a helpful insight into how we think as a CDFI and as you encounter other CDFIs in your own areas. And I think some of you are international, so I apologize if this context isn't as relevant, but bear with me for a moment here. And while conservation is relevant to both urban and rural communities, a lot of it happens in rural America, which does represent 2/3 of the US land mass and 14% of the population, or about 46 million people. And by most measures, these rural regions tend to be older, they're whiter, they're less well educated, at least by some measures, and they're typically poorer than metro areas, and are more likely to suffer from persistent poverty, which is poverty that's persisted over multiple decades. since the Great Recession, unemployment rates in rural America have decreased in both urban and rural regions, obviously. But according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, while rural America is still down over 100,000 jobs, suburban and urban America have added something like 3 million jobs. That's all pre-COVID, so these data have obviously changed, but I think we can safely assume that many of these patterns will persist, including other trends around lower educational attainment, lower workforce participation rates, and lots of challenges with substance use disorders that exacerbate employment and wage divergence. So I mentioned that CEI is a community development financial institution. We are very place-based organizations, and I think in that sense are quite akin to the land trust network, which I think of as a very place-based industry. I know you have national intermediaries and organizations as well, but you also have a lot of people on the ground doing work either through individual land trusts or chapters of national organizations. Our work is primarily focused on financing and investing in businesses that create opportunities for people and communities with low incomes, in addition to the other outcomes that I mentioned. So we're looking at all potential investments through that lens, and we're often working in what some of you may have encountered my colleague Charlie Spies, who runs our New Markets tax credit subsidiary, and actually who was trained as a forest entomologist, just as an aside. But he refers to these communities as having shallow economies, meaning they're often dependent on a single mill or a single industry. And so if something happens to one of those, the whole community can really be devastated. So the bulk of what I think of as like true conservation finance transactions that I think would be most familiar to many of you has really used a federal tax credit program called the New Markets Tax Credit. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of that, but the long and the short of it is that the nature of the credit and the benefit that it provides to investors means that it can translate into lower cost capital for a project. At a smaller scale and using more traditional debt sources, we finance many natural resource businesses, as I said, including farmers who are starting or growing their businesses. And periodically, although less frequently, just because of our capital structure, we will work with farmers who are acquiring land and sometimes need bridge financing as they await financing through easement programs or those sorts of things. We've worked on the New Markets tax credit side, and as I said, on forest land transactions with more of a conservation finance element. We've worked extensively with many entities, but have done several transactions with Lime Timber, who I think is probably familiar to many of you, and I think I think Peter Stein spoke with all of you earlier in the week. But I like to highlight Lime because I think of them as a very creative company, and they're willing to go beyond a simple transaction and get involved in sort of more complex transactions, which is kind of what we're often focused on or get involved with just because of the nature of things. But I know many of you may be familiar with our community forest transactions as well, and I can highlight some of those, but I did want to highlight
Just
first.
2-minute warning.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Allegra. We should be okay here. I wanted to highlight a more recent project that we did with Lime that's in West Virginia, and I think it highlights a lot of the great opportunities inherent in conservation finance, particularly when you have an alignment of interests focused on both sustainability and economic opportunity. So this particular project is called the Lime Mountaineer Investment, and it added a little over 118,000 acres of timberland in a multi-county region of West Virginia to Lime's portfolio. An interesting element of this is that through Mountaineer, Lime is also focused on improving worker safety and creating new employment opportunities for individuals living in these very highly distressed parts of West Virginia with poverty rates that are in the neighborhood of almost 40% and unemployment at almost 15%. And again, that was pre-COVID, so very distressed part of the country. And for those of you familiar with West Virginia, you'll know that it has very steep and mountainous terrain, which makes it very difficult for timber harvesting and very dangerous for the timber harvesters, with a lot of potential for injury. And so part of this transaction, Lime is bringing something called winch assist technology to the region, which allows logging crews to operate harvesting machines on slopes that were previously had to be logged by hand. The machines are tethered by cables to an anchor at the top of the slope that supports the harvesting machine so it can remain upright on the hill. And this is good because it protects workers by moving them into a cab and increases productivity and can create higher skilled, higher paying jobs with better benefits. This technology has been used elsewhere in North America, but hadn't been used in the East. And so the flexible financing that we were able to provide via the New Markets Tax Credit Program helped make the cost of the implementation feasible. And so, this project was projected to preserve about 24 contracting jobs, create 5 new jobs, and another 18 new contractor jobs. And we like this project because it's providing what we think of as quality jobs, where people are receiving pay above the living wage for that region, as well as health, life, and disability insurance, and retirement plan. This is quite different than a normal, like straightforward conservation project, but as I noted, it highlights some of those key elements we look for, namely commitment to good jobs, sustainability, and more broadly shared prosperity. And it's an example of really going beyond a basic transaction and intentionally integrating components that benefit both the land, but also the people who live there in very tangible and direct ways. Do I have like 30 seconds left?
Yeah, you got like time for some closing remarks.
Okay, all I want to say is this. Another reason I like this deal is that really highlights the dynamic relationship between land, people, communities, and the economy more broadly. And none of those exist in a vacuum. And I think these types of transactions also help make conservation even more relevant than it is, than we know it is, to people in these communities and build support for it across the country. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Keith, and thank you to the rest of our panelists. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and figured we could all just turn on our videos to do the Q&A portion. So I might need to allow you all to turn on your videos. So just give me 1 minute. So I figured, first of all, I noticed that our panelists have been busy in the Q&A answering questions. So that's fantastic. We don't have a ton of questions in there right now. So I'm going to ask a couple moderator questions of our panelists. And while I'm doing that, please feel free, folks, to keep typing your answers into the Q&A box, and we'll have some time to get to those later on. But like I said, just wanted to kick it off with a question to each of you to kind of help put a finer point on your remarks. And Keith, I figured I would start with you since you just finished your presentation. But you touched on this a little bit, but I hope you go a little bit deeper into the opportunity for land trusts to better connect with CDFIs right now, since there's this imperative to get capital to communities that need it in light of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest opportunities, particularly for land trusts who are engaged with agricultural land at all, and Jacob can speak to this even better than I can, but I think food production is a huge area of opportunity. I think it was an opportunity before COVID, but I think it's really highlighted the opportunities in places, at a local level. We've seen that part of our loan portfolio, it's mixed and businesses are still adapting, but a lot of the savvy businesses have really pivoted and to provide local food to local markets. And I think it's an area that as part of our strategic plan, but I think you've seen the disruption in many of the national and global supply chains, particularly with like meat, for example. And so I think access to land, I meant to look up the number of the turnover in land due to farmer retirements, but Jacob, you may know the actual number, but it's a huge transition that's going to be projected over the next few years. And that's an area where, I mentioned the local footprint of land trusts and just the knowledge that land trusts have about their local communities, but also about complicated real estate transactions. And so I think that's an area where if you have a CDFI in your local community or even in your region, CDFIs, one of the reasons we exist is to fill market gaps. And so when farmers or others can't access traditional financing, that's a good role for us to play. And we work with folks like Dirt Capital and others who can bring more resources to bear as well.
Great. That's a really important point. And, Keith, you mentioned you've never been to a boot camp before. Well, you might be one of the first CDFI representatives to present at a boot camp. So we're excited to kind of, draw your sector in a little bit more and find those connections. So definitely appreciate your points today. Katherine, I want to throw it back over to you. So you made a lot of excellent points about opportunities for land trust to get a piece of the pie in mitigation funding. I guess my question is, how can a land trust get started? If you are interested in mitigation and interested in getting a piece of that capital, where are places to look or connections to make to kind of start that process?
Yeah, I'm always happy to chat. Of course, there's a great resource that Land Trust Alliance published together with Environmental Law Institute and the Nature Conservancy back in 2012. You can find that report online. It's a very comprehensive overview for land trusts to look at all the risk reward, shall we say, elements involved in doing mitigation, either as a mitigation bank or as an in lieu fee program. So I would start with that report. I guess one thing I'll just mention, this is of course, this is a very capital intensive activity. So a mitigation banker, when they decide they're going to establish a mitigation bank, upfront outlays all the capital to either acquire a piece of land in fee simple, or to lease the mitigation rights from a landowner and buy a conservation easement from that landowner. Then outlays all the capital for the engineering, permitting, design of the physical restoration. Then outlays all the capital to physically put the restoration in the ground. I mean, we're talking, it can be tens of millions of dollars of capital outlay at the beginning of a mitigation bank process. It takes about 2 to 3 years to get a mitigation bank approved through the agencies. And then it's at that point, 2 or 3 years after this capital outlay, that the mitigation bank sponsor can start selling the credits on the open market and recouping that capital investment. We are capitalized like Jacob's firm is with private investment capital. So that's of course a consideration for land trusts as they're thinking about which of the different roles I described, do they want to be more in the position of sort of the risk reward capital outlay as a direct mitigation bank developer, or would they rather partner with a provider who's taking on that risk? But I would start with that report that I mentioned at the beginning.
Excellent. That's really helpful, Katherine. So Dylan, I hope you can hear us even though we can't see you. You can hear us, right? Okay, good. Yes, we can. So it's funny because, it's not funny, but 5 months ago, your presentation would have looked very different than it did today. But one trend that as you mentioned, continues to go forward is the increased interest in the voluntary carbon market. So I'm curious, for folks who are listening to this, who are interested in carbon markets, trying to see how they could get engaged, what should they be thinking about with this increase in interest in voluntary markets? I mean, could any land trust just sell some carbon since they have a wetland? Or, what should folks be thinking about as the voluntary market continues to take off?
Yeah, so we'll know that in the voluntary market, these are corporate social responsibility buyers that they're to continue to do business, especially with the new younger generations. There's a certain amount of social license. I mean, they do. It's not really compliance, and yet the world has changed, and for them to continue to do business, they have to demonstrate that they indeed are good corporate social, good partners. And carbon offsetting is part of that. while they don't have to buy for compliance purposes, they're looking for good stories. And that's very hard to quantify. But what I can say is that, you know, the tip of the spear are land trusts. You know, land trusts are, they don't want projects that bring liability, that where folks can, you know, kind of take pot shots and say, well, you know, there's where they're going to discover something that, you know, like a Superfund site, or, you know, something that's going on, or where there's, you know, the extreme harvesting as compared to, you know, conservative harvesting. I mean, that can cut both ways. I think that you can ask very reasonable questions about land trusts and say, you know, were they going to harvest anyway? So, but, you know, with projects with land trusts, especially for newly acquired lands or lands that are just, you know, in the acquisition phase, or being protected with, you know, not just fee lands for land trusts, but, you know, the partners that they're, you know, putting a conservation easement on, where the level of protection is somewhat fresh, and there can be especially a demonstration that the carbon finance was a part of getting a deal done. I think there you really do have a good story and argument for what we call additionality. You know, but for the carbon project, it was hard to, you know, put a layer of protection, which ostensibly results in more carbon being sequestered or kept on site from happening than if the carbon project wasn't there. And I also note that, you know, there's a lot of work that's being done right now. You know, I think I alluded to this, that the significant barriers to entry right now for landowners are the inventory and the verification costs. Those are the big development costs, and the monitoring, reporting, verification, or MRV costs associated with a project. And the current standards and protocols, just like any kind of, you know, regulatory system, they always lag the technology. There's great technologies that are out there now that you know, are an order of magnitude or more, you know, less expensive than putting, you know, some boots on the ground to do a fixed radius plot, or to send people out into the field to do, you know, change detection and monitoring. You know, we have remote sensing, we have satellite data. But those technologies haven't trickled into the standards and the protocols yet. But that change is happening as we speak. And so, you know, I would say don't lose hope for the land trusts that have, you know, are under current economic feasibility, you know, where you still do need, you know, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres or more to make a project pencil out. You know, very soon, you will see offerings come out where, you know, we're going to significantly reduce or eliminate the barriers to entry for landowners, and be including land trusts, and be able to get smaller landowners, you know, in the order of, you know, hundreds of acres, access to the forest carbon markets.
Great. That's definitely something to keep an eye out for. So thank you, Dylan, as always, for kind of helping us read the tea leaves there. So Jacob, last question for you. So, you know, looking at the map of where you all work, the thing that probably jumps out to a lot of people is that there are huge development pressures, you know, suburban development on farmers in the regions that you work with. I'm sure a lot of folks on the call, even though they don't work in New England or the Mid-Atlantic, have those same development pressures in their regions. So, you know, keeping that in mind, I'm curious if you can just speak a little bit more towards the interplay between, you know, investment capital, conservation, and farmland access, and how you're trying to create access, you know, through private capital given these development pressures.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a really good question, and something we, think about all the time. Excuse me. I think I'll answer that in two ways. I think first, I think it's important to note that conserving farmland doesn't equate to affordability or accessibility for farmers. So in various parts of our geography, farmland is conserved, often with public funds, but does not include agricultural restrictions that require it continue to be in use by a working farmer. So in areas like Eastern Long Island or the Hudson Valley, or Berkshire County in Massachusetts, oftentimes money is, and maybe Massachusetts is a bad example because they have really strong, restrictions, but, in other areas, Connecticut, farmland can get conserved, for a farmer and with a farmer, but then that farmer goes to put the property on the market and they can sell it to whoever wants, a second home or a hobby farm, which might, prevent that property from being subdivided or developed, but doesn't necessarily provide, accessibility or affordability for a working farm operation. And so folks interested in learning more about that, I would point to the examples of Vermont and Massachusetts, which have agricultural affordability restrictions written into all of their easements through the Vermont Land Trust and the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Preservation Restriction Program that actually limits on transfer between one owner and the next. It gives the land trust the ability to, basically step in and decide that a new buyer does not qualify, and in Vermont's case, buy that property at its appraised agricultural value and then transfer it to, to another farmer. The National Young Farmers Coalition has a really good report talking about this and other tools that land trusts can use from a land trust perspective to provide, answer that question, provide access and affordability for farmers. So that's part one. And sorry if that went on a little bit long, but that's, I think, a really important one that land trusts, can take on themselves. And then I think where private investment capital can interplay with conservation funds and farmland access is really in filling gaps. And I think those are kind of two major categories of gaps in our work. One is about flexibility of capital. So that includes the ability to transact very quickly if needed, and also create deal structures that comply with conservation funding programs, which can often be very inflexible. So we've done a lot of that structuring work in different deals where we're working with conservation partners in different funding streams. And then I think secondly, it relates to expertise. So in our case, not always, because some land trusts also have this expertise in-house that we work with, but in a lot of cases, kind of the part of the project that includes underwriting and supporting the business side of the farm is something that land trusts don't bring to the table, and often kind of seek us out for partnership on projects. And I think, the other thing that we often provide a lot of support for farmers and sometimes land trusts as well is negotiating the transaction, evaluating the land for its market value as an agricultural resource, and also, its price. And I think a pretty familiar example to a lot of folks is that there's often a timing mismatch in conservation easement transactions that, in the timber space, lime timber, which has been brought up before, often, does transactions, that kind of fill that timing mismatch gap. We do some of those. The Conservation Fund, also provides explicit bridge funding for that particular timing gap. And then in our case, like I said, we also take on the risk and provide support in our role for both the farm business, not just the underwriting, but take on the risk through owning the project, leasing it to a farmer for the farm business actually performing, to take on that risk and provide ongoing support for the performance of the farm business over an extended period of time.
Great. Thanks, Jacob. Mark, I realized I skipped over you, but I do have a question for you. So, just more generally, curious what Quantified Ventures' view is on what private capital brings to the deals that you work on that you can't get from public or philanthropic capital?
I think the first answer I would give to that is scale. I think private capital can often be a hammer in search of a nail, and it needs to be guided, I think, appropriately, particularly to projects in the conservation finance space that can't necessarily bear market rate returns. But the reward that you get for finding the appropriate way to stack capital into a project like that is the scaling potential. And we think of private capital and as a portion of a capital stack in almost all the projects that we work on. A lot of the projects that we've developed, in fact, probably almost every single one, has been paid primarily by philanthropy or grant funding from federal or state sources in the structuring portion of the transaction. I think that's something that may go away as the market matures more and investors are willing to take more what we would call development risk. But the reality is, once you can get past the gateway of kind of getting a project to the point where private capital is interested, which is not something to take lightly, it's a challenging development process, but you get access to a portfolio of different types of private funding sources that are just at a scale that doesn't compare to typically to public sources. And I think it's generally pretty good at taking risk. I think I mentioned that, but we design our transactions to shift as much risk onto investors as we can. They get paid handsomely sometimes for taking that risk. And for projects where there is a risk-averse entity, whether it be a coalition of municipalities or a municipality or a state government or a land trust or a private landowner, the investor's ability to take on risk in return for capital, I think is critical to catalyzing conservation projects, conservation finance projects generally.
Great, thank you, Mark. So I definitely want to save some time for Brad. Brad, as usual, you have a really good, 30,000-foot view on how these presentations all come together and how we can kind of pull lessons learned and common threads through them. So love to hear if you have a question for all the panelists or just some sort of remark to pull it all together.
I don't know about pulling it all together, but I'm happy to try. I want to build on Mark's scale point. And I really admire the work that you all are doing, the amounts of private funding you've brought into conservation. But it feels like more money could and should be coming in. Or do you think we're tapped out now? And if you think more money should be coming in, you all have been at it a long time. What are the big barriers still to be overcome so that we can get to that bigger scale?
I mean, my direct response to that would be we're definitely not tapped out. I think we're at the forefront of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in history. And I think there's more capital sitting on the sidelines than investable deals. I'll stop my answer there because I'm sure others have perspectives on that, but that's to answer part of your question there, Brad.
I agree with Mark on that, Brad. I mean, speaking from a CDFI perspective, and this is our own fault in some ways, we're kind of still a bespoke sort of boutique investment, if you will. And so we're trying to make it easier for high net worth individuals to invest in us. So we're now working a lot more with wealth managers. And so trying to translate our work through them to make it, to become like an approved investment for wealth managers and stuff. But I agree with Mark that I think there's just a lot of capital on the sidelines still that needs to be made. Our work all needs to be made visible across the whole, all the sectors that we heard from today.
I think part of the reason that some of that capital is on the sidelines is not because the investment opportunities are not compelling. They are very compelling, but it's really about investment bite size. So in order to get a lot of the really large institutional capital investors, pension funds, large endowments, they need to move so much capital at one time. So for example, some of our investors need to move $100 million at one time. So in order to scale up our investment bite size so that we can attract interest from that major institutional capital, I think is one opportunity and challenge for the space.
Yeah, and I just weigh in there. I think that's a really good comment, especially in the voluntary market. I mean, we're happy to facilitate the transfer of, big oil's money to land trusts and tribes and other private landowners, but right sizing these projects is really key. And there is a Goldilocks zone. I mean, these projects have to be big enough to be economically feasible, but even the biggest buyers, on the plan of offsets have a limited appetite for offset volume or placing, a certain amount of capital into one particular project. So that's a moving target, and hopefully that target will get larger over time. But right now we kind of have to find, there's sort of a sweet spot for forest carbon offset projects. And I guess the good news is that we have a lot more flexibility in the voluntary market to right size these projects, and our tools to bring either smaller landowners together through aggregated or pooled projects is increasing, or again to take advantage of new technologies and write those into the protocols to reduce the barriers of entry for smaller landowners is increasing. But for forest carbon offsets, I mean, there's pretty good money out there. Again, it's kind of right sizing these projects and matching them up with the buyers.
Thanks.
Great. Well, Brad, I think that question actually put a really good cap on the discussion. For folks in the Q&A whose questions we didn't get to, I'm sorry, but hopefully you can follow up with our panelists. They've shared their contact information in their slides, but they can also share it again in the chat so everyone has it. But I just want to say thank you so much again to Katherine, Dylan, Mark, Jacob, and Keith for your great presentation and discussion. Thank you as well, Brad, for your engagement on this session. And with that, we're wrapping up the 2020 Bootcamp webinar short course. So I just have a couple of final remarks here. I won't keep you guys all too far past the hour, but just want to say we so appreciate everyone who was able to join us this week. We really cannot wait to be able to host an in-person event safely in the future once we are able to do so. And we hope to go further in depth into each of these topics and also get to workshop our attendee projects. As Brad knows, the chance to workshop projects is one of the most exciting parts of the week. And it's really hard to recreate that virtually, although we might try, depending on how much longer the situation goes on for. But we hope this webinar series hopes you all maintain enthusiasm for the course and keeps you wanting more. I do want to say thank you again to our co-host and our partner for this webinar series, the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. I also want to say thank you again to our funders for the bootcamp, the William Penn Foundation, and also John Earhart via the Tides Foundation. Thank you also again to our CFN co-founders, Brad Gentry and also Peter Stein, who joined us on an earlier session. They've joined us for 14 years now, so hopefully we're doing something right here to keep folks engaged. We don't have a timeline for when the webinar recordings are going to be available on the website. Just depends on my web development skills when we can get those uploaded, but we will try to do it as soon as we can, and we'll email all of you when they're available. But in the meantime, please explore the resources on our website. We have a monthly e-newsletter, original articles, toolkits, other webinars that we've done in the past. And we'd also love to hear from all of you. So please email us with any feedback that you have. If you found the sessions interesting, too basic, too complicated, we want to hear any and all of your thoughts. And last but not least, for those of you who applied to the in-person course, again, please just wait for an update from us in July or August, and we're going to see what might be possible there. But until then, everyone, please stay healthy and stay safe. And thank you again for joining. Have a great evening.